From breakthrough devices to the bottom line, we explore the investment trends, the commercial models, and the strategic thinking required to bring neurotechnology to the global market. This is the Business of Neurotech. Hello, everybody. I'm your host, Adam Fraser, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Nicolas Vachicouras, who's CEO and co-founder of Neurosoft Bioelectronics. Neurosoft is a Geneva-based EPFL spinout building soft, stretchable electrodes that sit on the brain's surface rather than penetrating it. They've just closed an oversubscribed seed round. They're partnering with Max Hodak's Science Corp, and there's lots to talk about. Nicolas, a very big welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me, Adam.
It's a global show, but you are our first European-based guest, shall we say. So thank you for expanding our geographic parameters.
You're welcome.
Also, I mean, as we date stamp this, I've recorded 7, it's still a relatively new podcast, 7 episodes of the Business of Neurotech to date. BCI has come up in every single conversation, whether it's the founder angle, the funder angle, the analyst angle. So fantastic to have a practitioner in the trenches building a BCI company on the show, and looking forward to unpack all of that entails. So Nicolas, just please kick us off. Tell us a bit about your career today, your backstory, and your journey that ended up with founding the company you run today.
Yeah, with pleasure. So on my end, it all started with my studies in microelectronics, nanotechnology, so a field that is quite far from BCI's initially. And very early on, I discovered how microelectronics could be used to develop better interfaces with the human body in general. So I joined a lab of Stéphanie Lacour at EPFL in Lausanne in Switzerland, where she was developing what she calls soft bioelectronic interfaces, and that was leveraging all these microelectronics techniques. So it's very similar to what we use today in semiconductor manufacturing processes for chips, but with softer materials to build better electrode arrays that can both record and stimulate any biological tissue. And there was a very strong focus on spinal cord stimulation back then. And this is how I discovered the entire field. So it was extremely interesting to see, first of all, how primitive the technologies out there to interface with neural tissue were being used in the clinic, and how this could be drastically improved with these kind of new, softer, safer technologies, and also higher resolution. And so that was really when I was doing my studies, during my master's. And I really loved the science. The technology was really, really amazing. But I also realized very quickly that academia can go so far. Usually it ends up with a publication and maybe, a few papers, but that's basically it. And so it was pretty clear to me, even before I did my PhD, that we needed to bring this to the next level with a startup company where you have a dedicated full team, more funding to really focus on developing this. So that's kind of how I got into the field. And I thought that this was the best way to really have an actual impact on patients beyond just a publication.
Yeah, you had a very deep and rich academic career and journey. Was there a kind of aha moment when you thought, no, I've got to get this into the field? Did you always envisage you'd be commercializing something at some point?
That's a good question. So I think initially when I started my studies at TPFL, I knew nothing about entrepreneurship, what it meant. But I was able to learn a lot through a small contest. I remember it was the second year of my studies where we were pitching a bracelet that was nothing to do with BCIs. And I remember we were very proud at the finals about our algorithms and all our bracelet hardware, the printed circuit boards. And I remember the journey looked at us like, okay, but what's your IP? What is your SWOT analysis? What is your DCF, cash flow, business plan? And all these words were completely unknown to me. And so this is really how I discovered this entire other phase of building a company. It's not just about the science and technology. So I think for me, it became quite obvious that you have to really think about the entire aspect. So for me, I was lucky that I knew about what it means to build a business, and I learned a lot during my studies. And I think the aha movement more on the technical side is really when I discovered all of this really cool technology that was being developed in this lab where I did my master's and eventually my PhD. And I think it was really, as we were building it and seeing the potential. So I don't think it was one day, but it was building up until, kind of the end of the PhD where I really started Neurosoft.
Yeah, it's a fascinating thread I want to pull on during this podcast when I have founders like yourself on, because there's many brilliant scientists in the world, but a brilliant scientist isn't necessarily a brilliant entrepreneur or a naturally, business savvy person. So it's that Venn diagram of when the science translates and you take that leap into the commercial world.
Indeed, no. I mean, it's very hard even for me today. Like, I've been doing Neurosoft for many, many years now, but it's still, always not easy to separate the, engineering myself and then what I need to actually do. So actually, I haven't really done anything technical for the past 5 years. It's mostly about pitching,
Sure.
talking to investors. But I do think that neurotech has this very interesting niche where it's still the discussions we have with investors are very technical. And I feel like someone who would have just a business background doing this would be very difficult for them. And so I still end up going very deep into, especially when you're in due diligence with investors who really go deep inside the science, the technology. And I'm pretty happy I have this background.
Yeah. I mean, beyond the sort of note-taking, pure workflow apps that are everywhere, there's a deep, rigorous scientific foundation to pretty much all neurotech.
Exactly.
Companies. So look, let's get into Neurosoft. You've been doing it, I think, for 6 to 7 years now. Tell us about the story. Give us the elevator pitch for what you're building.
Yeah, so for us, we're trying to think of what is the best way to acquire high quality data from the brain at scale. And by at scale, we mean really from multiple brain regions, because most, if not all, brain functions work in networks. And so one of our founding principles is that as the devices that interface with the brain become larger and larger, because you want to record simultaneously from different brain regions, so you can get a really holistic understanding of how the human mind works and specific brain functions. We realized, and that was tying to what I discovered during my PhD, is mechanical properties matter. Like the brain is extremely soft, squishy, like panna cotta or tofu, whatever you prefer. And being able to do this in a safe manner, to have something that records very high quality data, requires what we believe is important to build these soft, stretchable electrodes that are minimally invasive and that provide safety long term. So this is really where hardware meets data. I think the big bottleneck in this industry is we don't have enough data to understand how the brain works and to understand brain functions. And so we are starting with building the hardware that is necessary to unlock that.
Yep. Just a quick hat tip to brain networks. I work at Omniscient. We focused on connectomics. So I'm all in on the brain network thinking, the symphony of different parts of the brain doing different functions. But just look, Nicolas, this is a fascinating topic. When people, certainly business professionals like myself, so the non-clinical specialist audience, hear the word BCI, they sort of imagine a brain chip, a physical, almost one of those like tiny batteries that we've all kind of grown up with in digital clocks. Now you're talking about something very different in terms of your hardware. So without getting too deep into the technicalities, just explain a bit about the hardware approach you're taking for your BCI.
Yeah, I think a better image for people is not a chip, but a kind of a sheet or a membrane that contains electrodes. So you can think of them as pixels. And each of these electrodes or pixels can record or actually stimulate. So you can do read and write. But let's keep it to the reading part, where you can really record activity of the brain locally. And so we really try to build these sheets leveraging very, very soft materials, because historically, the materials that were used to build these devices that interface with the brain were made with very rigid materials, which don't interface well with the soft tissues. So that's kind of a better image, is think of a sheet or a membrane that goes around the brain. And we might be talking about this after, but there's different ways of interfacing with the brain, with devices that go inside, that remain at the surface, or that are even non-invasive. But what we're building is really these sheets that go on the brain. So we're in direct contact with neurons without penetrating tissue. And we record this activity on a large area.
So let's just unpack that a little bit further, because I think the level of invasiveness is also relevant here. So again, the headline reader may say, oh, there's a dozen plus BCIs all going for the same market, all with broadly the same approach. But when you go one level deeper, that's far from the truth. There's different types of hardware, material science, which you've touched on there, but there's also a level of invasiveness, whether the artifact sits on the brain or penetrates deep in the brain, like a Neuralink or a paradromics. So talk about the interaction of both the material science, but also the level of invasiveness.
Yeah, I think there's exactly two levels to it. There's the materials that are used to make the device, and then there is kind of the level of invasiveness. So the way I think about it today is there is the penetrating electrodes. So these are devices like small needles that can be hard or soft, like what Neuralink is building, that actually penetrate inside the brain. So they can record what we call single neurons, so very fine recordings. Then level 2 is what we're building, which is we're still in direct contact with neurons, but we remain at the surface. We do not penetrate. Right. So these are what we call subdural electrodes below the dura, or ECOGs. So that's level 2. And then you have technically what we call epidural. So I think for a very good example is this new device that just got approved in China. So they are below the skull, but above the dura. And then you have devices that are below the skin, above the skull. Right. And then you have the ones that are not even, just outside wearables. So you have all these levels of invasiveness between, wearing them on your head down to going inside the brain. And so you have the entire continuum.
And this is where presumably there's a trade-off between the quality and granularity of the data, the speed of access, but also the friction point. Are you having major neurosurgery, burr hole surgery, or putting a cap on your head? They're very different customer experiences.
Exactly. I mean, that's at the end of the day, you have this summarized trade-off between invasiveness, which means more surgery, less accessible to people, versus the quality of the data that you're recording. So it's pretty obvious that the closer you are to the neurons, the higher the quality of the data. But our hypothesis and the fundamental principle behind why we believe in implantable brain-computer interfaces is that we don't know enough about the brain today to try to understand it just by recording very far. It's like trying to understand how the universe is working with our glasses. So you need tools that really allow you to go very deep to understand the fundamentals, and maybe we'll learn enough that at one point less invasive interfaces will be enough. But we're not there yet. And I think it's important to have these more invasive devices.
Great. Look, great backstory or backdrop to the BCI sector and the hardware approach you're taking. Take us a bit more into where you're at in terms of trials, testing, indications, your go-to-market business.
Yeah, there's different elements to it. So because we are developing these very soft materials already here, we have a big technological challenge. The softer the materials we work on, the harder it is to build these high resolution electrodes. So we've spent a lot of time optimizing this. So at first, and that was a big overlap during my PhD, and before that, where the lab I was working in, we're developing these interfaces for animal studies. So we went through multiple animal, small, larger ones. And with Neurosoft, we were able to go to the next step, which is going into humans. So here we're currently piggybacking on existing surgeries where patients have their brains open, either because they have an epileptic seizure or a brain tumor and they have to literally remove part of the brain. So we ask if we can, use this for like 10, 20 minutes during surgery to test our devices. So we've done that in 10 patients in 2 ongoing studies in Houston, Texas, in the US, and in the Netherlands, in Europe. And so that's where we are today. And so our goal is to try to extend that implantation duration beyond just intraoperative, going to 30 days, and then eventually to chronic, which is when you have the device actually implanted, let's say permanently inside your skull. So these are kind of the different stages, and we are at the first in human stage.
It's been a long academic journey, and BCI is a long game. That must have been quite the feeling as the founder when the first human trial took place.
Yes. So I was very stressed that day. So it was in Houston. I remember it was the first time we were testing it, and there was a lot of things we were not sure if they're going to work because we were recording very, very small signals. I usually give the analogy that brain signals are about 1,000 times smaller than heart signals. So very hard to capture. And when you do this in an operating room where you have all these different machines generating a lot of noise, electrical noise, it's not clear that you're going to be actually able to record anything. And so the first patient was quite stressful, especially that we build our devices in-house. So it was an additional level of stress of, okay, is our devices actually going to work that we've built ourselves here in Switzerland?
Yep. Like being a parent at the birth of your first child. I'm sure you'd wanted to be in the OR and getting regular updates how it was going. And so 10 plus patients in, are you broadly pleased with progress to date, the clinical data you're seeing?
Yeah, it's been great because we've had a variety of neurosurgeons use it, and so we get a lot of very interesting feedback on how it can be improved. It could be small things like length of cables, or design layouts, or just general things that we can learn about. And then we've also seen how the data we collect can be very high quality. And I think for us, what was really insightful, especially in the Netherlands, and we've published this recently, where they have these resected areas, like literally a cavity inside the brain, and they cannot access them because the electrodes they currently use are too rigid. And so they've been able to go into brain locations with our electrodes that they could not with other ones. And so I'm quite happy that this is not just about testing the device, but we've actually brought value to some of these patients, even at this early stage, because doctors were able to record brain signals and actually help the neurosurgeon remove the correct parts of the brain. And I think I'm very happy about that.
It's the world of sci-fi is here and now. It's happening today. It's quite incredible, the innovation within Neurotech and BCI specifically. So talk a bit about, Nicolas, your vision from a clinical point of view. I know you explored tinnitus in your early days. You've evolved, as many BCIs have, to kind of movement. Where are you at, and what's your kind of current thinking on your long-term roadmap of where you go with this?
Yeah. So it's interesting because when we started, Neuralink had just barely started. And so we were still thinking about what we're building as a kind of a single indication medical device company. And indeed, we spent a lot of time trying to find what is the key indication. And so tinnitus was one of these kind of huge unmet clinical needs. And still up today, I still believe this is a very strong unmet clinical need, where you have patients who have these ringing in the ear, extremely severe, like a lot of them, attempt to commit suicide due to depression. It's really, really horrible. And there's a lot of patients who are impacted. About 15% of the world population has tinnitus, and 10% of them, or a bit less, have the severe cases. So we had identified this as a very cool indication as a medical device company. We also realized that in the world of fundraising, sometimes it's important to also listen to the feedback from investors and where the money is going. And so it's true that today, motor BCI, so devices that are intended to provide either movement or speech to patients who are paraplegic, tetraplegic, or who cannot talk anymore, has been where really the money is flowing. So this is our focus today, but we still think that tinnitus is a big one, and we really want to pursue this down the road. It's just a question of what we prioritize. Now, the good thing is, because we're building a platform, 90% of all the work we're doing at the moment will serve not only motor or epilepsy like we're doing today, but also other indications. So that's kind of the, let's say, focus change. What has dramatically changed is how we're thinking about the company long term. So initially we were like, okay, we're going to maybe become a device for tinnitus. Whereas now we see the value in better understanding the brain and building foundation models of the brain, leveraging all the data we're collecting through these patients. And so this is really where we see that the value is about how we can leverage helping patients, and also learning more about the human brain, which I believe will come as a positive feedback loop to better understand the brain, build better therapies, and therefore have more impact.
So platform approach, multiple indications over time. Yes, the capital markets give you the cold shower, the reality of the pragmatism of the sequencing and how you sort of bite-sized chunks. Is mental health long-term, your North Star? Is that where you envisage this ultimately goes?
I think that's one of them. There's definitely a lot of things, because at the end of the day, the brain controls the entire body. So I think the limits are, it's unlimited. Mental health is a big one. I think the complicated part is that these are specific brain functions that are very hard to understand. So I think today, a lot of people are focusing on motor, for example, because it's a brain function that is still very complex, but that we understand a lot better than others. So I think we're seeing a lot of companies in motor, sight, deafness, so for hearing, because these are, let's say, relatively easy functions to understand and to look at the behavioral data from patients. And then there's a much more complex one that are very subjective, and that's where we start going into more complex human cognition, and I think this is where mental health is. So I think this is going to be a very big impact. But I'm not an expert on this, but I think as we start building these better devices and easier to understand indications, we will also open up a lot in mental health. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. You mentioned feedback from investors. Talk a bit about your funding journey today. I know you've had some grants and some non-dilutive funding, but you've also got some high caliber VCs on your cap table. So talk about what you've raised, where you're at, and who your investors are.
Yeah. So to date, we've raised about $21 million. Half of it has been through grants. I think that's one of the big strengths of Europe and Switzerland. We have access to a lot of early stage grants, especially if you're building technologies and universities that you want to spin off. I think there's great support to do so. And so we've definitely tried to leverage this as much as possible. And then as you progress, then of course you start looking at, private equity. Which is, business angels, accelerators, and then obviously venture capital firms. So this is where I've learned a lot. We've done a lot of mistakes. I think the first mistakes we've done is we waited too long to start talking to investors when we had a lot of free money from grants. And I think I didn't appreciate how building these relationships early on, especially when you don't need the money, is important. So I think that was one lesson for me. The other one is, unfortunately, Europe is great at the beginning. It's not great, unfortunately, today for growth. And so really what changed a lot in the past year or so, and that's how we were able to also fundraise, is focusing more on the US. And so like most of our investors are from the US. We're lucky to find a European investor in Greece, Skybound, who led our seed round. But again, if you look at the team, they are been heavily influenced by the American mindset. One of the GP built his company in the US. So I think that was the other big learning curve while we were fundraising, is the money is today in the US. And I think the main reason is because these type of developments take so long. You really need to have a long-term vision and approach to this, which unfortunately, in average, it's very hard to find in Europe.
Yeah. I think investor relations is something, it's a constant need, and not going only when you need capital is a very smart move. And also just call it the sales cycle, the length of time, even when someone's interested, it takes to do a deal. I think people from the outside underestimate, and it's clearly something you've learned from your early fundraising. Talk a bit more, Nicolas, because again, thank you. Your first European guest, medtech, health tech, neurotech. It's very US focused, both in the media, the volume of capital, the activity, and obviously the size of the market. You're uniquely positioned to kind of opine that you come out of Switzerland, you have some European investment. Do you go straight to the US? Is that your go-to-market focus, or are you going to also explore the European markets?
So ideally both, but we are starting with the US, even though, so for example, I explained that we have ongoing clinical studies in both the US and Europe now, and we're opening a third clinical center here in Switzerland soon. But I think from a commercial perspective, the regulatory environment today, at least for our first product, is very attractive into the US with the FDA. And so we're focusing on that at the moment. But we're still interested in going into Europe, CE marking the devices down the road. But we're definitely starting with the US first, yeah.
Right. In terms of future rounds, I mean, it's notable both on a percentage basis in terms of BCI funding as a share of neurotech funding. I think it's over half. Even in calendar 2026, the number of large rounds, $100 million plus off the gate. Yeah, out of the gate, people are raising very big early stage rounds. You've raised 21 to date. What's your sense? You're up against some very well-funded, notable competitors in the market. How much do you think you'll need to raise, and how do you compete with people raising? I mean, Neuralink's raised over $1 billion, for example.
No, for sure. I mean, interestingly enough, it's very what we're building is very complex for everyone, and so just throwing money at it is not always a solution. So I think we've been fortunate enough to know the field very well, even before Neuralink existed, and so we've learned a lot already while we're developing all these technologies in academia. We were one of the pioneer labs in this space. And so I think it allowed us to minimize our mistakes. And so we were able to achieve meaningful milestones with a tenth of the money from some of our competitors. And I think I'm quite proud of this. I think we've learned how to use our money, in a thoughtful way. Now, of course, that gets you so far. And so for sure, as we are growing and, going to commercial and scaling the company, yes, I think these, larger, much bigger rounds will be necessary for us. And so we're already thinking about the next steps. But again, I think I'm quite proud of how the team was able to reach really amazing milestones with definitely 1/5 or 1/10 of the money from others. And I think that's one of the strengths of European investors in general compared to US, again, in average.
Yep.
Yeah.
So related to fundraising, let's talk strategic alliances. And very specifically, you've just announced recently an alliance with Science Corp, Max Hodak Science Corp, which again, interesting on many levels, but to the headline reader, people will be like, aren't they your competitor? Oh, yeah, don't you compete with those guys? But talk a bit about that partnership and how, I guess, the BCI value chain is already starting to fragment along specialist lines. And this alliance illustrates that.
Yeah, I think the question we ask ourselves is, what are we very good at and where do we think we provide the most value? And so building a BCI has all these components. You have the electrode array, which is in contact with the brain. You have the system that actually captures this and digitalizes information, then transmits it outside of the body. Then you have all the AI layer, understanding it. I mean, you have all these different, multidisciplinary components. And so the way I've looked at the field, being there now for 15 years, is I believe that the very big bottleneck has been the electrode interface, because this is really where electronics meets biology. And so this is where everything, typically breaks, or because you have the body attacking your device. So we thought this is what we're really, really good at. And that's what I call the front end of the technology, because it's kind of the first layer after the brain. And then there is all of the other components, which are, again, very difficult to develop. And, companies are developing some of these components individually, very deep new technologies, which is the chips that digitalize information, and then all the wireless transmission. And there's a lot of, issues to be solved here with heating, bandwidth, transmission, safety, cybersecurity, and whatnot. But we thought where we bring value is really on the front end. And so this is where the partnership with Science made sense, because they've built a lot of these other components that we are integrating. And so the integration is really difficult. And that's, I think, where a lot of the value is. But we thought that if we can avoid having to develop all of these other components, which easily would have cost us $100 million just to develop all these different components, I think working with them really accelerates our development and also reduces dramatically the amount of money we need. And so for me, it made a lot of sense to do this partnership.
So in the simplest terms, and there's nothing simple about Neurotech, or definitely not BCI, you're the hardware front-end data capture layer, but Science Corp bring the platform, the operating system, kind of the back-end machine to
on the hardware side
process the data. Yeah.
Yeah. So we're still building internally all the AI software layer behind it. So once the data is captured and extracted out of the body, we're still in the loop. And I think that's where the value is down the road, is on the data. So this is something that we really want to build in-house. But this intermediate kind of back-end hardware to actually get this data out in a safe, high bandwidth way, this is where Science comes in. And then we come back with the data software layer.
Yeah, it's a fascinating development pretty early in the evolution of BCI, because, again, looking at Precision and Neuralink and Paradromics, some of the others, I guess I'd say they're end-to-end. They're trying to do that entire value chain. But your alliance implies a future world where this market will be so significant. And we often touch on with BCI, the ultimate TAM is 8 billion brains. If you think about the problems of the brain and the potential of the brain, ultimately everyone could benefit from this tech. That it seems like, as many markets do, it will fragment along specialist lines across the value chain.
Yeah. And I think, it's interesting because a lot of people look at BCIs as something new, but what we're describing here is very common in medical devices, even for neurology, but they're not called BCIs. But companies that provide different components as an OEM supplier, for example, to companies that then just maybe focus on the therapy or one component and bring in other components from other partners, is pretty common. We've seen this a lot in neuromodulation, not necessarily for the brain, but even peripheral nerves, spinal cord. And so this is not completely new in the medtech field, but it's indeed very new in the whole BCI, where at least some of the giants there are really going full stack end to end internally.
Yeah. So BCI, as I touched on in my episode with Naveen Rao, who analyzes the sector, confirmed the importance of BCI. But just zoom out a bit, Nicolas, to your views on the broader neurotech landscape, TMS, focused ultrasound, connectomics, image diagnostic, data analytics, people trying to build large brain models independently of BCI. Do you feel like it's helpful for BCI that there's a thriving, broader ecosystem that this market is big enough that everyone can play, or is it kind of a competitive sense that in some ways you're competing against TMS, neuromodulation, focused ultrasound, and some other non-invasive approaches?
That's an interesting question. I think it depends a lot on if you're looking at it from a technology perspective or indication perspective. So when I think of tinnitus device, for example, I look at our competitors who are not building BCIs, like hearing aids, headsets. And so I think it's kind of the same here, where there's enough to be done with the brain in terms of all the medical conditions you can think about, that I think there is, from a medical perspective, enough to be done by multiple players. I also think that having this entire ecosystem brings value for us, for everyone, because at the end of the day, the meaningful aspect, which I think we bring to the table, is this high quality data. And as we get more and more data that provides more information about how the brain works, I think this becomes extremely helpful for all these other companies who can then build better therapies with this better understanding of the brain. And so this only works if you have other players who are interested in the data that you're collecting and the insights that you're getting from the brain. So I think overall, it's a win-win for everyone.
Yeah. And even within BCI, I mean, we can debate, are there 8, 10, 12, do you include China, 15 plus very credible players now in the market? Do you think there's enough room for many to succeed? On a 10, 20-year view, like most markets, will there be 2 or 3 big winners and the others will have disappeared? What's your sense of how BCI is going to evolve?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's hard to predict, but I wouldn't be surprised if we see consolidation between mergers and acquisitions within the space. I think that will make sense as the field grows. But yes, I don't think there will be a monopoly, for sure not. But definitely big players, the same way we see in tech, where you have like a few very big players. I wouldn't be surprised if it ends up this way. But I believe that it's also in the benefit of patients and hospitals and clinicians to have access to different technologies. Because again, depending on exactly the indication that you want to look at, a technology will be better than another. And I think it's impossible for only one company to do all possible neurological conditions. And so I think we will have different companies that have different choices.
Yeah. There's a big old market out there for problems of the brain. So plenty of room for everyone.
I believe so.
Last question on Neurosoft BCI. Obviously, the FDA is a major factor in the evolution of the sector, but talk about reimbursement as well, because presumably long term, if this is going to scale to the millions / hundreds of millions / billions, reimbursement has to be a big part of that.
Yeah, that's the big challenge. And I think that's also where sometimes being a second is better, because the front runners have to build up these reimbursement codes. So interestingly, China has implemented reimbursement codes for BCIs. They're the first country to do so. And so I know that there's a big push within the community, and I've been very pleasantly surprised in the US. A lot of the companies, including ourselves, are working together with regulators and trying to find ways to get these reimbursement codes and clarify what are the clinical endpoints, how do we define success from a clinical perspective with BCIs. And I think this is where everyone is helping each other, because it's, again, a win-win to have these reimbursement codes. But it's not easy. It's very complicated to show value, especially that who bears the cost today in BCIs is spread out. And so being able to convince, one payer to pay for it, if they're not actually, spending all this money through the entire care of, these patients who are, for example, tetraplegic in the case of a motor BCI, is very complicated.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So everything in medtech, Nicolas, is multi-stakeholder and complicated.
Yes, it is.
Okay, I want to be respectful of your time, Nicolas, but just a couple of final questions. Let's shift gears and just talk about kind of the human story, the founder story, and building a team in such a long-term, this is a long game. This is not a get-rich-quick scheme. No medtech is, but BCI, you're talking decades, not years. Yeah. Just talk about as a founder and your co-founders and the challenge of bringing a team on such a long-term journey.
No, it's not easy. The good thing that we have going on, I think, is inherently BCIs are multidisciplinary and are very, very hard to do. And so already intellectually, especially when you need engineers from different backgrounds, it's very motivating because you have very complex problems to solve. And that's also one of the reasons I love this field from a more like personal curiosity. So I think that's one great way of attracting people. The other one is that it's really, like, as I said, technically difficult, but also very impactful. And I think today, especially, I see more and more people really wanting to do something beyond just, I want a salary, but really want to have an impact on the world. And so I think that has helped a lot for us, and I'm sure other companies, to recruit within the space, because you're combining something that is intellectually challenging, plus that is meaningful and impactful for the world. And I think that helps to build these teams that stay motivated long term. And then I've been very surprised, but more and more people and engineers get interested in this field and build their own hypotheses in terms of, okay, which technology do we believe the more into? And I think that has helped us get some very, very bright talent, even though we don't have the same amount of capital as other competitors. But people who have studied the brain, like, you know what, I believe that, it makes a lot of sense to do like these soft stretchable electrodes. I think that's the only way that this is going to become safe at scale. And that helps us attract talent that believe in not only the mission and the vision of the company, but also in the technology we're building. And so I think all of these ingredients have helped us to recruit very strong talent so far.
Yeah. I mean, again, we see this omniscient as well, having a purpose, mission, values-led company with a deeper purpose absolutely draws staff in. It helps with staff retention, but even investors, of course, they want to make an appropriate capital return, but adding that making the world a better place layer, definitely a factor in neurotech investing.
No, for sure. And I think depending on the profile of investors, sometimes the impact weighs more than financial, and other type of investors, it's the opposite. But I think both components help, yeah.
Absolutely. And then geographically, do you see where is the team now split between Europe and the US, and where do you see the growth from here?
So today, most of the team, I would say 85% is still in Switzerland and Europe, where we initially started the company. Me personally, I'll be in New York most of the time as of this summer, building up the team. We hired our first engineer there, and we'll hire another one later this year. And I think as I'm thinking of the next round and as we're going to grow, I think the US will grow more and more. I think it comes from the fact that it's going to be our primary market. So if you're thinking about sales and marketing, and also the partnership with Science there in California. So of course, as we start building these fully implantable BCIs, a lot of the development will be done in the US. But I still think we'll always have a foot in Switzerland because the innovation here is really amazing. EPFL is one of the best universities in the world for neurotechnology. Sure. And so keeping a foot there is going to be critical. But I think the growth will probably come more into the US. Also, that's because that's where the money is.
Sure. Yeah. Nicolas, thank you so much for joining the Business of Neurotech podcast. Neurotech as a sector is pretty exciting, but there's no more cutting edge, exciting place to be than BCI. Mm-hmm. Congratulations on your progress today. Good luck for the future. Incredible progress today, and wish you all the best with the journey from here. Before I let you go, Nicolas, where do you want to send people that may want to learn more about your work online and, of course, the work Neurosoft are doing as well?
I think our website is a good starting point. I also started a blog, just my last name.com, vachicouras.com, where I tried to explain some of the key concepts. So I started with the mechanical properties. So I was quite happy on that. And then, of course, if you just go on a website, we also show all our publications and peer-reviewed articles. I think it's an important part of building a BCI to be very transparent about the technologies we're building. So I think there's great scientific papers to be read to learn more about what we're building from a more scientific perspective.
Excellent. I will put those links in the show notes. Nicolas, thank you so much for joining the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Adam. It was great.
Thanks for listening to the show. For more information on the podcast, individual show notes, and all the links about where you can find the show, please visit businessofneurotech.com. We look forward to seeing you on a future episode.